Hello, and thanks for joining this LinkedIn conversation about resilience and the built environment. I'm Stephanie Miller, HOK's Director of Public Relations, and today I'm joined by three of my colleagues who are deeply involved in resilient design and whose work helps ensure buildings and communities can respond not just to threats imposed by climate and nature, but also societal changes related to public health and social equity. We'll discuss these issues and more over the course of the next 25 or 30 minutes. But first, let me introduce everyone. Michelle Van Hifte is HOK's Sustainable Design Leader for Resilience. Based in Austin, Texas, she has more than 25 years of experience in resiliency as it relates to architecture, urban design, and community health. Also joining us is Bill Kenworthy. He is a regional leader of urban design for HOK's Northeast practice, and he's based in New York City. He's worked on waterfront districts and resiliency efforts for over 20 years, and that experience includes time spent working within the New York City Department of Planning. And then Brian Yenchek is HOK's firm-wide director of planning, and he's based in San Francisco. Brian also has decades of experience assisting developers and communities when it comes to climate responsive design and urban resilience. So, Michelle, Bill, Brian, welcome. And we also want those of you who are watching us live on LinkedIn to participate. So, as the conversation goes on, please post comments or questions in the chat, and we will get to as many of those as we can. But let's dive in. So, you're each in a different place around the United States, and each one of those areas is dealing with your own specific issues and challenges related to resilience. First, what are, say, the biggest concerns in your region when it comes to resilience? I realize there could be more than one. But Bill, why don't we start with you here in New York City?
Sure. So some of the biggest climate impacts and related to projections for sea level rise, as well as more powerful storms affecting the city. And both these constraints start to create flood situations within the areas of the city. And as sea levels rise, it'll become more inhabitable over time for certain areas that have development in them today. So, a lot of the challenges that we're going to be facing is in the outer boroughs, especially, is to start to figure out where new development can occur related to transit that's high and dry and resilient in the face of rising seas up to 6 feet in the next 100 years, as well as more powerful storms. And some of the worst weather events we've had in recent years have been areas that never flooded before, and it's because the drainage infrastructure from cloudburst events is actually overwhelming the infrastructure system in the higher ground of the city. So we have to start to think about where transit opportunities are existing and proposed, and think about how new mixed-use development can be guided to these areas that will be safer over time.
Great, thank you. And Michelle, moving east to the middle of the country in Central Texas, what are some of your biggest issues?
In Texas, we're experiencing both the shocks and the stressors of climate change. Just over the past few weeks, strong storms with high winds and extreme rainfall and flooding resulted in loss of life, significant property damage, and power outages for hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses. Transportation and communication systems were disrupted, other forms of infrastructure were disrupted, and there are still more storms forecasted for the next couple of days. We're experiencing more extreme temperatures, definitely in our summers, along with prolonged drought and the negative effects that they have on our public health and affordability. Last summer was our second hottest on record, but this past summer we broke the records for days above 100 degrees. It's likely we're going to have a La Nina summer, which is going to result in higher temperatures and lower rainfall, and that's going to put more strain on our energy and water systems. And even though the strain of heat waves has always been a challenge for Texas infrastructure, the last 3 winters have also brought us extreme cold and ice storms, placing a new seasonal strain on our energy and water systems. These conditions are significantly impacting the affordability of housing and commercial real estate. The cost of financing has increased. Conventional lending models are trying to absorb more risk and underwrite resilience. The cost of operating and maintaining and insuring buildings under these extreme conditions has increased. So the ripple effects, they track down to tenants and homeowners, and they make a lack of affordable places to live and work, And then, unfortunately, the vulnerable populations are most impacted.
And then, Brian, moving over to the Bay Area, what would you say are the one or two biggest challenges or issues around resilience?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, it's interesting in California, in the area where I live and where I am today, that the challenges that Michelle and Bill just outlined, we're finding are increasingly entangled or stacked in some interesting and even more challenging ways. Take, for example, California, of course, famously known for its seismic activity, not unique to California, but certainly a big part of the challenges we face here. The seismic activity that we experience across the region, across the state, certainly here in the Bay Area, it shakes our cities and it shakes the underlying soils beneath the buildings and streets and parks where we all live. The output from that is our cities, especially on the waterfront, tend to migrate out, in the case of San Francisco, into both the Pacific Ocean as well as out into the Bay, often referred to as drift or subsidence. That lowering of the city and migration of the soils beneath the city, coupled with, as Bill mentioned, rising seas, it creates an entanglement that's especially challenging because the state agencies and funding streams that address sea level rise and address geotechnical and seismic matters completely different across all three levels of government. And so, as we look into the future, we need to think more and more not about resiliency issues in isolation, as a menu or a buffet, but more as a dish. How do they all work together? How do they compound each other? How can we finance and address the challenges, on the backside to resolve a lot of these matters? On the flip side of all that doom and gloom, there is certainly hope. The Bay Area, and I think we'll talk about this more in the session, especially with cities and waterfront communities, these same challenges are now creating a real focus and a new vision for how we want our waterfronts and cities to be at a time when I think a lot of us are questioning the future of our downtowns and cities. So I think we'll get a little bit more into it, but those are the two main concerns that we're seeing out here.
Great, thank you. And so, moving from identifying some of these most pressing issues to picking up the thread of hopefully being a little positive, what can we do about it? And we are a group of folks who work as designers, engineers, planners, landscape architects. Bill, going back to your research and decades long investment in how to address sea level rise, what do you think from a design solutions or approaches at least? What are you looking at to move this move the needle on this?
Well, because of the expansiveness of New York City's shoreline of 500 miles, and the lower scales of development happening in the outer boroughs to protect, we've started thinking about strategies about planned retreat as we look at 6 feet of sea level rise coming in the next century, and the areas of the city that might be affected, and those areas that might have the opportunity for the redevelopment I was talking about in and around near transit. We found that there's 60,000 acres of the city could be in the floodplain, and almost 1.4 million people potentially impacted in the vulnerable areas of the city by those more powerful storms I was talking about. So that's based on the last census, and that's a huge population. We have to start to think about housing in a city where the housing affordability is already stressed and needing a new supply, both for dealing with the affordability, dealing with the growth of the city over time, as we continue to thrive going through and into the next century, but also to address potential migration from these areas that are at threat, and have hopeful visions of what the new mixed-use portions of the cities might look and feel like, the character of those new neighborhoods, addressing what the new coastline might start to look and feel like as the city evolves under these threats of sea level rise, and to think about a vision for New York City that starts to really express everything New York is today and everything New York wants to be in terms of its hopes and a vision for the city for everyone. Of its 9 million people in population today, growing to over 10 million as we get into the next century.
Oops.
And Michelle, what do you see as the role for policy and codes as they relate to resilience?
So there's several market and regulatory drivers informing resilient design right now. For example, more requirements for reporting climate data disclosure and risk mitigation, like the new SDC rule that will apply to all publicly traded companies in 2025. And a global call to action from the United Nations recommending risk and vulnerability assessments, climate proofing our infrastructure, and new forms of public and private funding and financing. Designing for resilience possibly means designing beyond code. Land development codes and building codes are not keeping up with the impacts of climate change shocks and stressors. Without an updated standard, individual projects need to define their own strategies based upon their site's exposure and vulnerabilities. For example, a code may require designing for a 100-year floodplain, but a flood-prone site that has experienced so-called 500 and possibly 1,000-year floods very recently will be looking to design to the 500-year floodplain. There are new guidelines being developed that will help people advocate for better codes. They provide code overlay language that can be proposed to municipalities, code councils, and entities that develop standards. There's some out there about how to update the codes for heat resiliency, how to update the codes to resist wildfire, and to better even recover and be prepared for those disasters. And policies that incentivize resilient design are needed to support the implementation of strategies that would not otherwise have been funded and therefore not possible. And there are good examples at every scale, city, state, and federal. One example is the Inflation Reduction Act's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. It helps public entities fund resilient design measures and carbon emissions reduction measures. We're currently assisting a public entity client to help fund these measures on a critical community asset and assisting them with writing their grant application.
It's,
And
just to pick up on that real quick, go off script here, if that's all right.
jump in.
The as we were preparing for this, I think the hope and optimism around the resilience measures and regulations that Michelle just outlined, which are very serious, very grounded in fact, very policy driven. I think on the personal side of things, I find it refreshing that as opposed to putting more debt and credit on future generations, which is a lot of how the American economy and most of the economies of the world work, right? We're actually investing in the future. When we invest in these resilient measures that Bill and Michelle just outlined, we're putting dollars into infrastructure, buildings, parks that are meant to last longer and face some of the challenges that they just outlined. And that gives me hope as a father, and as I look into the future for all of us, that we're starting to actually push investment in that direction, as opposed to always leaning on future generations. Back to what I'm supposed to answer, Stephanie. Out here in San Francisco again, back to the Bay Area. So I really think about the soils in the Bay Area, which really is a series of hills surrounded by water on three sides here in San Francisco. It's during a seismic event, it's a little bit like after a meal when you've had a little too much to eat, you need a belt. There's a seawall underneath the ground that actually wraps most of the city that was built well over a century ago. It's masonry. It sits down there and it keeps the soils that are mostly muddy, mushy from oozing out, as I mentioned before, into the surrounding waters during earthquakes. Well, those walls are very old, very damaged, and in disrepair. And so San Francisco is embarking on a once in a, I'd say, multiple generation and a century effort to reimagine what we refer to as our Embarcadero. HOK is working on perks and other projects along that necklace of the San Francisco waterfront, which is very well known, very well visited by people from around the world, that is very much under threat, both seismic on the land side and of course sea level rise on the water side. A seawall, how do you create broad constituency and advocacy and support for a seawall, right, Michelle? Again, it's a little bit like policy. We got to get people excited about these things. And so advocacy engagement is really, really key. While that infrastructure, that seawall that's going to sit down there, that belt around San Francisco is going to do the hard work. In order to build it, we have to completely demolish many parts of our waterfront and then reimagine them. And that's where it becomes interesting. Wetlands, parks, trails, bikeways, tangible benefits that communities, voters, taxpayers can understand and buy into. And that has certainly taught me, and I think my colleagues as well, that how we communicate our response to some of these challenges that we just outlined, which are very serious, is very, very important. We've got to get the yeses. We've got to get people excited about what that future can look like. And then we got to begin to craft it all together. What do we want our waterfronts to look like in the future, right, Bill? I know you're on the front lines of that. So I think that's the optimistic side of things.
Well, and that's a great segue into the next part of the conversation, that all of this has to do with community, and there are so many different kinds of community. But how do we bring everyone along? The residents, the local people in your example, Brian, who might live near the Embarcadero, the political leaders that, Michelle, we maybe need to incentivize to have the will when they're running on a 4-year election cycle, the finance. How do we as the design community advocate and build community that's going to really get these solutions enacted to create these resilient cities? Anybody, throw it open.
Well, I think what we're hearing is that the issues of sustainability and resiliency are completely inextricably interconnected with land use decisions, transportation decisions, housing types, location of housing, and then energy and water and infrastructure, what its sources are, how it's being distributed. Um, I attended the ULI Resilience Summit recently, and there was a call to action that said every policy, funding, design decision has the opportunity to be a resiliency decision. And these decisions should strive for outcomes that are greener, cleaner, and safer. So, incorporating and integrating resiliency into these concepts of sustainability and health and well being that have become more mainstream, that is the current urgent call to action. And being able to say that and have that actually reflected in policies is where advocacy comes in. So, people can ask, does my city have a resiliency plan? Does my state have a resiliency plan? Is there a local municipality that is leveraging federal funding that is available to make these investments that Brian was talking about in my community? And if you ask those questions, you may find that there's a 100-year water plan, like I have in my city. There might be a heat resiliency plan. There might be a climate action plan. And there might be funding associated with it and opportunities to advocate for better codes and standards so that we not only find ways to invest in these measures, but raise the tide that floats all boats and raise our standards so that projects everywhere have a level playing field and can begin to be designed in a more resilient way.
I think part of the effort is also to make sure you're reaching out and getting as broad a group of community members engaged in the conversation. And sometimes that means you have to go to them if they're not a community that's technologically enabled, or what that means going to a house of worship or finding ways to get to those populations that don't usually participate in those public meetings. Um, and to make sure that, again, you're getting a cross section of folks. Some folks won't come out to a public meeting. Maybe it's a survey, or maybe there's other means of being able to engage them in the conversation to get some feedback from them. And also to make sure that you're using graphics. In our research, we're constantly using intense graphics, both 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional, not technical, to tell that graphic story so we can make these issues accessible to folks who don't have the technical background to read technical plans, but to make the visualization that very real so they can understand how this is going to impact them going in the future.
Really. I think Michelle, when you said in my community, that really struck me. That sense of pride, ownership, authorship. Um, these lands that are often challenged, they are owned, they are stewarded by the communities right around them, and so I think, just to build on what Bill just shared, we have to lead certainly with empathy. We have to be incredible listeners as we convene broad groups, and I think where I began my career 25 years ago, we focused a lot on that word engagement, which is a perfectly fine word. But I think more than conveyance of information, really it's about participation. We're finding, especially around issues of resilience that are very, very challenging. Participation with communities means that they're at the design table with you, working through the problem. Their pens are on the paper. In the case of the Bayfront Park in San Francisco, it's often referred to as the Bayview letters, Bayviews being more waterfront communities in the southeast part of San Francisco, certainly threatened by various matters that we already outlined here. One of the hallmarks of the park was creating this large identity monument, this gateway open space for the Bayview neighborhood. And the letters, if you go and look at them online, there's only one Bayview letter, so it's very easy to Google. The actual mosaic and the construct of all that was made by the community. We actually brought in plates and dishware and ceramics from people's families and homes they didn't need anymore. We shattered them on a gymnasium floor at a school. They then plastered those pieces onto the letters, and it became this point of pride for a waterfront community that's facing a lot of change. I think that last point, change is scary. A lot of these resiliency matters are forcing us, as Bill said, to begin to look at how we're going to adapt. And adapt is a code word for change. And so back to maybe where your question began, Stephanie, communicating. um, what are the positive outcomes from change? What does change look like? How can we both mitigate its impacts on these communities, empathize with them about what they're facing, and then with them craft that future, which I think can actually have, again, a lot of positive benefits. But to work through that takes a tremendous amount of empathy and engagement.
Well, and you've answered, we're starting to get some questions from people who are watching live and continue to post them. But one of them was, how do you educate the general public on resilience? That the built environment community, in this case, they say the construction business understands it, but the average may not. And I feel like, Brian, the story you just were sharing is absolutely an example of it. And then, if you're up for it, we have another question from the audience. Resilience is about fortifying the built environment, but also working with nature, such as creating spaces that can take on flooding and then bounce back. Could the panel discuss a little more about that type of resilience? Bill, I feel like this is aligned with a lot of the research you've been doing.
Yes, absolutely, and we do have a significant amount of waterfront parks at the edge of our city. 20,000 in the area that could be impacted by this the sea level rise we're talking about. But the idea of having those uses that can accept the flooding and deal with those issues and then bounce back with, whether it's the species selection or the way those areas are designed to allow for the most serious floods to be deflected in some way from areas where people live, but are still useful amenities on a good day, is the way we should start thinking about the edges of the city as we evolve. And just trying to understand what those correct uses for each community is going to be at the water's edge, as these issues start to find us. Like any other open space design or amenity design, we engage the community. We need to start to think about those issues on the longer term scale as the lines in the city move, as these impacts hit us.
Right.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that
Yeah.
we're trying to design for public health in these extreme conditions, and we're designing not only for the natural ecosystem to help the natural ecosystems resist these extreme conditions, but how to just enjoy being outside, how to do what you want to do outside. We all three live in places where you want to live outdoors as much as you can. So climate adaptive design and regenerative design and the value capture that you can find in design measures that look at co-locating services and amenities, performing ecosystem services like stormwater management, evaporative cooling, and connecting people and nature all at the same time, all with one design solution, is how we can be resilient and not just keep layering on disparate design solutions, but really look for the integrated design solutions that help the site adapt to climate change, adapt to extreme weather conditions, quickly recover from that, and all the while help us be outside, enjoy outside, and have our ecosystems that we want to interact with every day remain healthy and biodiverse and green and clean.
Well, can I throw in a ringer, something we haven't planned for? But all of the conversation we've been having right now about resilience has been primarily responsive to climate and natural impacts. But there's a whole other part of us that needs to be resilient as people, whether it's socially resilient, the economics. We just came through a pandemic, and how we've lived and worked in cities has changed. And as we grow, so as people who are also responsible for the built environment, regardless of what happens with climate and weather, how do you think about resilience when you're designing for a community, whether you're an architect, a landscape architect? Where's, I guess the question is, what's the social resilience that we can build into our cities?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one real quick. So I mean, it's always been important, right? Our cities have always been defined by where we come together as communities. It's one of the hallmarks and emblems of our cities and towns. And resilience in some of these changes that we're facing, certainly in our waterfronts, but elsewhere as well. It's forcing us to really rethink our public realm and open space, and not just the materials and shape of it, boardwalks, wetlands, and all of that, but also what we want to do together. What does everyone want to do across multiple generations, all backgrounds, where everyone feels welcomed? In the case of San Francisco, where the downtown largely supported really just two bases. There's the tourism base, which comes in the summer and maybe on the weekends. And then there was the worker base, which needed places to eat lunch and do things that we all do before, during, and after work. Now, suddenly, post COVID, we're looking at a mixed use downtown where now there's more and more residents, more and more families, more and more retirees, in addition to the tourists and the workers that still are there. They have a completely different set of needs within our parks and open space. And so we need to address that as we rethink our waterfronts, as Bill mentioned, and we think about the various groups they serve, as Michelle mentioned. That gives us everything we need to start to embed within our parks and waterfronts new programs and activities that just simply weren't there before. I think that's definitely how we get back to and making sure that our parks and open spaces are inviting and welcoming to everyone. And it's also a perfect time to start to respond to what do we want our downtowns to feel, and who do we want them to serve going forward. So that's the positive side of some of these
Mhm.
changes.
Well, we've talked about the key issues, we've talked about some of the solutions or opportunities to address them. And then we've talked about how we can come together to advocate for these changes as the design community and the broader community. And we talked about policy and code. Is there anything, anything we haven't talked about or brought up that you feel like is really important to add to the conversation today? If not, we can wrap it there.
We cover it.
I would just reiterate the interconnectedness of all these issues, and that some of the conventional ways that projects are financed, funded, designed, pushed through the regulatory system, resiliency is asking those models to bend. And resiliency can be a way to support change on all those fronts, and try to show the interconnectedness of all of those pieces and parts. Because if one piece falls apart, the whole chain may fall apart. And that is something that I'm hearing in my own community, is that if I could just get over the financing barrier, or if I could just get over this regulatory barrier, or if there's, and that was another thing that was shared at the ULI Resilience Summit. When you're trying to engage people, go find the barriers, but go find who are the heroes that are maybe in the shadows that have the answer to that, and bring them into the conversation. Because there's often someone in the universe of that project that has a solution or has had an experience that can bring a solution to that project that maybe already isn't at the table. So I think inclusion and interconnectedness and trying to help everyone realize that we need all of these, we need a kit of parts that addresses resiliency in every way that it can, to help push these solutions forward.
I feel like that was the perfect closing, Michelle. Great. Well, thank you for joining everyone on LinkedIn. If you do think and have continued questions, add them in the comments. We'll get back to you in the chat. And this will live on, so share the link with others if they weren't able to join us today. But thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.